There is a root vegetable that thrives in frozen ground when every other crop has surrendered. It grows sweeter after frost instead of dying from it. It stores in the soil itself for months without refrigeration, without processing, without any technology at all. For 4,000 years, this plant fed the peasants of Northern Europe through winters that killed aristocrats in their heated mansions. It sustained entire populations through famines, blockades, and economic collapses that destroyed every other food system. And here is what history wants you to forget. This was the crop that kept Germany alive when the money died. Then we erased it, not because it failed, but because it reminded us of hunger. We renamed it cattle, fodder. We associated it with poverty and shame. We stopped growing it in our gardens and stopped teaching our children that this single root once meant the difference between survival and starvation for 70 million people. Not because the knowledge became irrelevant, but because a crop that grows anywhere, stores forever, and cannot be controlled by supply chains has no value in an economy built on dependency. Welcome to history's hidden harvest. If you're new here, this is where we dig up the survival wisdom that empires tried to bury. Subscribe and hit the bell, because what they erased, we remember. The archive opens in 1916 in Berlin, Germany. A housewife named Frieda stands in a food queue that stretches around the block. The line has been there since dawn. By the time she reaches the front, the bread will cost 3 times what it did this morning. Her husband is fighting on the Western Front. Her children have not eaten meat in 4 months. And the potato harvest has failed. What happened next would scar German memory for a century. The winter of 1916 to 1917 became known as the Steck-Reuben Winter, the Turnip Winter. The British naval blockade had cut Germany off from food imports since 1914. The potato crop, Germany's dietary foundation, rotted in the fields after a cold, wet autumn destroyed the harvest. The nitrogen that should have fertilized crops had been diverted to explosives production. The horses that should have worked the fields had been conscripted for the military, and the men who should have brought in the harvest were dying in the trenches. What remained was the rutabaga, the Swedish turnip, the Swede, a root vegetable that Germans had fed to their livestock for generations, now the only thing standing between 70 million people and mass starvation. The German government established the War Food Office in May 1916 and began distributing rutabaga as the primary food source for the civilian population. The official ration dropped to 1,560 calories per day by summer 1917. By winter, it fell to 1,000 calories. The Imperial Health Office had determined that a healthy adult male required 3,000 calories daily. What Germany provided was 1/3 of that requirement. The death toll was staggering. Historians estimate that 763,000 German civilians died from starvation and malnutrition-related diseases during the First World War, with the turnip winter representing the acute peak of that crisis. Female mortality increased by 11.5% in 1916 and 30% in 1917 compared to pre-war rates. 80,000 children died of starvation in 1916 alone, according to a report from a prominent Berlin physician documented in historical records. Tuberculosis mortality rose 91% between 1913 and 1918. The number of typhoid cases doubled between 1916 and 1917. Survivors described conditions that seem impossible for an industrialized nation. Restaurants stopped printing menus because prices changed faster than food could arrive. People burned furniture for heat during the freezing winter. Middle-class families sold heirlooms to buy turnip soup. Children broke into barns and looted orchards, searching for anything edible. Workers received pay twice daily and rushed to spend it before its value evaporated. And through all of this, the rutabaga kept Germany breathing. The pattern would repeat. When the Weimar Republic collapsed into hyperinflation in 1923, when a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks, when restaurant prices rose while customers were eating, when a lifetime of savings could not buy a subway ticket, Germans returned to the same survival knowledge. Bartering replaced currency. Urban families marched into the countryside to trade possessions for vegetables. Those who remembered the turnip winter knew which crops could sustain them when the money became wallpaper. And the pattern repeated again. During the hunger winter of 1946 to 1947, the coldest winter on record in Germany, Allied occupation coincided with shattered infrastructure and destroyed farmland. Official rations in the British zone provided barely enough calories to sustain life. General Lucius Clay, the American military governor, warned that there was no choice between being a communist on 1,500 calories a day and a believer in democracy on 1,000 calories. German civilians once again turned to foraging, to wild plants, to the root vegetables their grandparents had survived on 30 years earlier. The Dutch experienced their own version during the hunger winter of 1944 to 1945. When Nazi forces cut off food deliveries to the Western Netherlands, official daily rations dropped below 750 calories. The Dutch government distributed illustrated folders on collecting and preparing wild plants, including stinging nettles, chickweed, and sorrel. Sugar beets, tulip bulbs, and rutabagas became essential survival foods. At least 25,000 Dutch civilians died from starvation and its complications during those months. The rutabaga's survival properties are not accidental. They represent 4,000 years of human selection for exactly these crisis conditions. A 2023 nutritional analysis published in the journal Food Science and Nutrition confirmed what peasant farmers knew for millennia. Rutabaga contains 35% of daily vitamin C requirements per cup, a remarkable characteristic given that this vitamin content remains almost completely intact during cooking. It provides significant fiber, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and B vitamins. Modern researchers at institutions across North America and Europe have documented that rutabaga contains glucosinolates, compounds with demonstrated anti-inflammatory and potential anti-cancer properties. But here is what matters for survival. Rutabaga is fundamentally frost-adapted, not merely frost-tolerant. Frost-adapted. The plant actually becomes sweeter after exposure to cold because freezing temperatures trigger the conversion of starches to sugars in the root. While other crops die at the first hint of frost, rutabagas shrug off temperatures that kill everything else in the garden. They can remain in the ground well into winter, with nothing more than a layer of straw or snow for protection. The soil becomes a living refrigerator, temperature-regulated, perfectly humid, powered only by weather and earth. This means that rutabaga provides fresh food precisely when fresh food is most scarce. Late autumn, deep winter, early spring, the hungry months that killed populations throughout human history. While stored grains rotted and preserved meats ran out, rutabagas waited underground, ready to harvest whenever the soil could be dug. The crop stores for 3 to 5 months in a cool, dark environment without any processing. No canning required, no refrigeration, no electricity. A root cellar, a cold basement, even a buried barrel provides sufficient storage conditions. In a world where supply chains can collapse overnight, where power grids can fail, where refrigeration cannot be guaranteed, this storage capacity is not a convenience. It is survival technology. The rutabaga had no place in that efficient system. It could not be patented. It could not be controlled through seed monopolies. It required no synthetic fertilizers, no pesticide applications, no complex processing before consumption. Peasant farmers could save their own seed, grow their own crops, feed their own families, without any participation in the industrial economy. From the perspective of corporations built on agricultural dependency, this was not a feature. It was a threat. After both world wars ended, Germans developed a profound psychological aversion to rutabaga. They associated it with humiliation, with defeat, with the memory of standing in bread lines while their currency became worthless. The French and Germans who survived on rutabaga stew during occupation and blockade refused to eat it once prosperity returned. The crop that saved millions became a symbol of everything they wanted to forget. The 2023 study titled "Sweet Potato as a Key Crop for Food Security Under Global Climate Change" noted that climate instability is making drought-tolerant and cold-tolerant crops increasingly critical. While that study focused on sweet potato, the principle applies equally to rutabaga. A crop that thrives in cool weather, survives frost, and produces reliable yields in poor soils offers exactly the resilience that monoculture agriculture lacks. Modern industrial food systems operate on the same principles that failed Germany in 1914. Efficiency over resilience, global trade over local production, dependency over self-sufficiency. The same logic that left 70 million Germans scrambling for turnips when the blockade began now governs food production worldwide. 3 corporations control more than half of global seed sales. 6 crops provide 75% of the world's food energy. Supply chains span continents, vulnerable to any disruption. If you want to recognize rutabaga's survival potential, learn the identification markers. The plant produces a round taproot with purple and yellow tinged skin, larger than a turnip, with dense yellow flesh inside. The leaves resemble other brassicas, but are smoother and waxier than turnip greens. Unlike many root vegetables, both the root and the young leaves are edible. The Germans who survived these crises did not rely on rutabaga alone. They foraged stinging nettles in early spring, a plant that provides 30% protein by dry weight and more iron and calcium than most cultivated greens. They gathered dandelion leaves, chickweed, and sorrel from roadsides and abandoned lots. They learned that survival meant knowing which plants grew wild in their own neighborhoods, which could be eaten raw, which required cooking to remove toxins, which could be dried and stored. This knowledge, passed from mother to daughter through generations of scarcity, was exactly what industrial agriculture replaced with dependency. The cooking is simple. Rutabaga can be roasted, mashed, added to soups and stews, or sliced raw into salads. The edges caramelize beautifully when roasted at high temperature. Mashed with butter, the flesh becomes almost silky. The flavor profile falls somewhere between carrot and potato, with a subtle cabbage sweetness that intensifies after frost exposure. The reality check is this: the rutabaga never left. It still grows in gardens across Northern Europe and North America. It still appears in traditional Scottish haggis meals, Finnish Christmas casseroles, and Swedish root vegetable dishes. Small farmers and home gardeners still plant it every summer for fall harvest. The survival knowledge that kept Germany alive through the turnip winter, through hyperinflation, through post-war occupation, is still accessible to anyone willing to learn. What was suppressed was not the plant. What was suppressed was the memory. The understanding that our great-grandparents survived economic collapse and military blockade not through government intervention, not through foreign aid, not through any system beyond their control, but through crops that grew in their own soil and knowledge passed from generation to generation. Every German family that survived 1916 to 1917 carried a debt to the rutabaga. Every child who lived through the hunger winter of 1946 owed their survival to foods that industrial agriculture had taught them to despise. The shame they felt was manufactured. The crops were salvation. Every person who learns this breaks the suppression cycle. Every garden that grows rutabaga recovers what industrial food systems tried to bury. The crop that kept Germany alive when the money died is still here, still growing, still waiting in the frozen ground when everything else has failed. If this harvest revealed something for you, subscribe to History's Hidden Harvest and hit the bell. Every like and every share helps preserve what they tried to erase. The next harvest uncovers soon.